And welcome to our new delegates. And hello to everybody who sees us from outside UCC and outside Ireland as well. I think we had a very good start yesterday. We had some very interesting presentations from Gail, Doug, and Teresa, and a lot of interesting workshops as well. Certainly set a very good tone for today as well. As you know, this is the 5th year of this conference, and in many ways we can say that it is going from strength to strength, not just in numerical terms of numbers. I mean, we do have more people registered this year than any other year, but also in terms of what happens during as a process and what happens as a consequence of this event. So I think it's also growing in terms of the kind of engagement, the kind of discussions we are having, the shift in the culture, which it can be subtle sometimes, but certainly there is more of a capacity and resources around generating the changes that we would like to generate in mental health, and certainly I personally feel much more resourceful as a result of these events. So just to give you an outline of the day, we have 2 keynote speakers in the morning, and then we have 2 concurrent sessions from 11 to 12, and from 11:15 to 12, and from 12:15 to 1. In case you haven't been in this event before, all the concurrent sessions are in Brookfield, in floors 1, 2, and 3. If some of the sessions are full, because in some of them there is a limited capacity, please just go to a different session. Just a couple of housekeeping things now. What do we need to note? Okay. Just to help all the people for their generous donations yesterday. As you know, this conference is not funded. We have very limited funding. We are funded just from our respective schools, and this year we received funding from Schliela, Renew, and the Irish Institute of Mental Health Nursing. So we are grateful for any donations that we received yesterday and that we may receive today as well. In terms of housekeeping things, just please note exits and the toilets are at the end of the corridor on the right. For the keynote speakers and the workshop, the concurrent session presenters for today, all we can give is lunch vouchers for coffee and lunch. So to get your vouchers, if you haven't got them yet, go to Harry, who's there. Other housekeeping things. The Kino event, yes, we have the music event this evening. Thanks again to Michelle Dalton, who organized it. There is a fundraising event with great music tonight in the Kino. You can get tickets at the door. It's €8. And bring your own booze, yeah. I think that's it in terms of housekeeping. Is there anything else? And also just to let you know that there is a small change in the program. I will be chairing the morning session instead of Paddy McGowan, okay? So we can be starting. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, John Reid, who is a professor of clinical psychology in the University of Liverpool in England. John has done extensive work in the whole area of adversity, trauma, and psychosis. And this is a very important contribution to broadening the debate around mental health and madness. So we are very glad to have John with us. Very welcome.
Does this work, Lydia? Yeah, it's on here already, I think. Okay.
There we are. And then it's just up and down.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah. That's good.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Harry and Lydia, for getting us all together here. It's quite a unique event, but people have said that before, but I just want to thank them for inviting me. When you asked me, I wasn't sure at first whether I could fit it in, and then Jackie Dillon and Eleanor Longdon said, you have to fit it in. And I always do what Jackie and Eleanor tell me, so here I am, and it's nice to be here with you all. I'm going to present quite a lot of research, which can be hard to take in, but I'm not apologizing for that, because I think it's very important that we arm ourselves with the truth about the sorts of things we're dealing with, because we have to confront on a daily basis, most of us, an awful lot of nonsense, the sort that Gail talked about yesterday. We're told that schizophrenia, well, A, schizophrenia exists as a concept, which it doesn't. B, it's a brain disease, which it isn't. C, it has a genetic predisposition, which it hasn't. And D, everybody who gets these diagnoses, which are unscientific and stigmatizing, needs to be on medication, which they don't. So I think it's important that you have some ammunition to take these battles on with. But first, I'll tell you a couple of stories, because the data itself can get a bit boring, so a couple of stories is that what helped shape my views. I mean, I could stand here and say I'm a scientist and I'm completely shaped by the evidence, which isn't true either, because I think we form our own views about mental health from our own life histories and our experiences, because it's a very subjective area, isn't it? We can't really answer all the questions with science, even though, as a professor, I have to stand here and pretend that we can. So a couple of stories that shaped me, both from the same inpatient unit in New York, in the Bronx. This is an American story for Gail, so it'll make you feel at home, Gail. My first job was in the Bronx as a nursing attendant. So there I was at 3 o'clock in the morning with a guy who had not opened his eyes for about a week. And to the extent that he was black and blue from walking into the doors and the walls, and purely out of boredom, not really clinical skills, because I didn't have any, out of boredom, I said, Bob, why have you got your eyes closed? And he opened his eyes and put his face right there. And I thought, oh no, John, wrong question. And he said, it's about fucking time one of you assholes asked me that. Well, we had all been looking up eye-closed behavior in the diagnostic manual to find out what disorder he had, so we would know what color pill to give him. And none of us had thought to ask him that. He then explained to me why he had been walking around with his eyes closed. He said, my family put me in here against my will to get insight. And that's what I've fucking well been doing. You have to think about it. It wasn't a mature way to deal with his anger, and I wouldn't try it at home or anything, but so my first lesson was, if you want to know what's going on with somebody, ask them. Rather than look it up in a book. And the second story from the same inpatient unit, which is not funny, was that I was assigned to do specialing, which I don't know what it's called here and now, but that's sort of sitting with someone who's acutely suicidal for an hour in shifts to make sure they don't kill themselves. And I don't know who was more scared, that the 20-year-old woman I was locked into the room with, or the 20-year-old man that I was. We were both pretty freaked out by this. And I said, because I didn't know what to say, I said, if you'd like to talk to me, that would be really, really good, but if you don't, that's okay too. That's not bad, is it? No training. Yeah, but she didn't want to talk to me, at least not that first day. The second day, she said my, and stopped. The third day, she said father. I thought, okay, we can do this one word per day. The fourth day, though, she said nothing. And then the following day, she said me. So now we had my father, me. And of course, when we got the family history, the missing word was raped. And that taught me many things, including the way that people tell you stuff without telling you. They tell you stuff symbolically or ambivalently because they don't know whether they can trust you, and it comes out in all sorts of ways. Not always directly. This woman, of course, had catatonic schizophrenia because she hadn't spoken for 6 months, so we knew what was wrong with her. There was something called catatonic schizophrenia, which was causing her to be silent And how do we know that? Well, that's what people with catatonic schizophrenia do, you see. It's a backwards circular logic, which is, with no offense to 5-year-olds, that's how 5-year-olds kind of think. Anyway, on to what I'm supposed to be talking about, but we'll get the advertising out of the way first. I'm going to make quite a lot of what some people think are extreme statements. I just want you to know there's research, a lot of research behind all of the things I'm going to be talking about, and this is our second attempt, the second edition, to bring all of that research together, so that the purpose of this book is for people to literally have the ammunition when people say silly things about madness, so you can actually say, well, actually, there's 337 studies saying you're wrong, which is kind of an important thing to be able to do. This book's kind of also interesting because it's pairs of chapters whereby the service user or the person who experiences a certain aspect of psychosis, whether that's voices or delusions or whatever, writes a chapter, and then there's a chapter by a professional or a researcher, so that's a nice little book too. I understand the bookseller's been and gone already, I think, so, but I'm told there's copies of most of these in the university bookshop. I have a couple of models of madness which can be sold at an extraordinarily cheap price. Okay, so first of all, obviously there's no single cause of psychosis, just as there is no single cause of anything in human life that's much more complicated than that. And don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all of these things, I'll highlight just some of them. We have to get out of the way this idea that there's a genetic predisposition to something called schizophrenia, because it's something that's caused an incredible amount of pessimism. And it's just wrong, and even the American Journal of Psychiatry is now acknowledging that. If you just look at the bottom there, this is a review of lots of previous studies claiming that there's a genetic predisposition. The distribution of test statistics suggests nothing outside of what would be expected by chance. It's important to know that, I think. This won't stop the geneticists carrying on. They now have abandoned their search for the schizophrenia gene. Brackets, what were they going to do if they found it? Recommend narrowing the gene pool so we don't have so many mad people or sensitive people in the world. Anyway, they've acknowledged they won't find it. They're now looking for combinations of hundreds of little ones that they acknowledge themselves, if they keep getting the hundreds of millions of dollars that they spend on this research, at the end of that, in about 20 years' time, they will be able to account for about 15% of the variance. And when I hear these things at conferences, I can't help myself putting my hand up and saying, can we have the money back at that point, please, so that we can spend it on something useful. My colleague Richard Bentle in Liverpool once said at a conference, show me a single patient who has ever benefited from genetic research. And I thought that was a bit extreme at the time, but I'm still waiting. Think about that. Okay, so the actual causes, poverty statistically is the most significant cause, not because poverty by itself causes anything, but because it's a predictor of all the other things that do cause all sorts of mental health problems. We now know from this wonderful research from Wilkinson and Pickett in the spirit level that it's actually relative poverty, which is even more predictive than poverty itself. Relative poverty being the difference between the top 10% and bottom 10% in any society. I'm just looking to see if Ireland's on there. Sorry, it isn't. The UK is doing particularly badly, and then the country on the far right, the country that gets everything wrong. I don't know how they manage to get absolutely everything they do wrong, but they do. I know Gail will not be offended by that. So you can see a fairly good correlation between that disparity between the richest and the poorest. And of course, this is 4 years out of date now, so the UK will be further up that line in the wrong direction. Then there's Italy, of course, that doesn't fit, but that's just Italy. There's not much you can do with that. Ethnicity also is a powerful predictor in all of these countries. In the UK, Afro-Caribbeans are 9 to 12 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, the standard explanation from biological psychiatry around all the poverty research is that it's not that poverty causes madness, it's the other way around. Madness causes poverty. It's the social drift theory that some of you, if you can remember your textbooks from undergrad days, the social drift theory. These people, all classes are affected equally, but then people dribble down to the bottom. That's why you find a lot of poor people with this diagnosis. There's a grain of truth to that, because these people are obviously usually struggling. You don't get a diagnosis like this without struggling in some way. So there's a grain of truth to it, but when you do longitudinal studies over 30 years, it's always poverty preceding the madness, not the other way around. And I'm still waiting for the ethnic drift theory to explain away all the ethnicity findings, and that would go something like this. Everybody starts off as a middle-class white Englishman, and as a result of getting schizophrenia, they become Irish, Afro-Caribbean, or Maori. I'm still waiting for that one. The area of research most is the area of trauma and psychosis, which when we started off was fairly controversial, not amongst the public, as I'll show you later, or amongst patients, or amongst carers, but amongst a certain profession, which shall remain nameless. So we started off just looking at the figures overall, which doesn't prove causal relationship at all. It just shows you there's something going on here that we should be talking about, perhaps. And that was mostly physical and sexual abuse. If you add in emotional abuse, emotional neglect, and physical neglect, the figures start getting up to the 80-90% mark if you add those together. And then there's things also like parental loss, which in this particular group of people, this is the first episode of Psychosis group, 12 times more likely to have lost mum in the first, I think it's 9 to 10 years of life. Again, each of these things by themselves doesn't necessarily cause anything. It's a combination, it's the accumulation of losses and traumas and bad things happening. In 2004, this is a bit of a journey really, because when we started out, as I say, it was quite controversial. And we didn't have any studies, hardly at all, on child abuse and psychosis. It was considered quite a taboo. So I'm not going to show you every single study, but this was kind of a key one in 2004 from the Netherlands, Jim Van Os's group, who found that those people abused as children were 9 times more likely to develop pathology-level psychosis. And those suffering the most severe levels of abuse are 48 times more likely. And that's what's called the dose effect. Sorry to bore you with methodology lessons here, but when you're trying to establish a causal relationship, it's not sufficient to show that A is related to B. If you can show that the more of A that happens, the greater probability of B, then you're a bit closer to being able to say it's a causal relationship. So there you have it. If you come back up to the top, you can see that they're controlled for a lot of things, including psychosis in relatives. So with or without a family history of psychosis, you get these kind of results. So where's your genetic predisposition now? That doesn't prove there isn't a genetic predisposition, which there isn't, but this doesn't prove there isn't. This proves that you don't need one for bad things happening to drive you crazy. By 2005, we put out what turned out to be a fairly seminal paper, which is the first review of what studies there were at that point, pointing out that this is indeed a causal relationship. We got a lot of media coverage for that. We come down to the bottom one. This is the Newsweek in America. The cumulative impact of this research has swayed opinion in the profession's highest echelons. And we all thought, that would be nice. One day. We're getting there, I think. A few more studies since. They come out now about once a week. I can't actually keep up with them anymore. Up to the turn of the century, there was about one every 5 years. Now this one comes out every second week. I like citing this one at conferences of biological psychiatrists because I like to say the last sentence several times. People who had experienced all 5 types of trauma that were measured in this particular study were 193 times more likely to be psychotic. And then I stand there and say, 193 times. And then I say, can you show me anything in the whole field of biogenetic research that comes anywhere close to that? Like twice as high? That's a bit naughty of me, but you have to kind of turn the volume up on some of these folk to get them to listen. 2008, this is just a nice little story. In 2008, I was asked to do another review of the literature as the studies were pouring out. Now, at first I said no, because it's, I've done that. People will either get it or they won't. This is a very new and very biological journal, some dreadful title, Clinical Schizophrenia and Related Psychosis. And they persuaded me to do it by telling me that this journal goes to the 20,000 psychiatrists in the United States who are most involved with psychosis. And when you're a bit grandiose like me and you think you're some kind of social change agent, that's kind of hard to turn down. So I said yes, and then I emailed them back and said, how do you know which 20,000 psychiatrists are most involved with psychosis? And I was so embarrassed when they told me. I felt so naive when they told me the answer because it's so obvious. They said, that's easy, John. The drug companies send us a list every year of the 20,000 psychiatrists who have prescribed the most antipsychotic medication. That's how good the research of the drug companies is. They're organized, they're efficient. So in this review, yes, there are now 11 general population studies, 10 found the same thing, 8 found that dose response. And we use that to remind people, and I remind you, because you might not know this, that last little bit there. You know the biopsychosocial model, or the stress vulnerability model that we're all taught is this nice integrated model of the social and the biological, except it isn't. It's a colonization of the psychological and the social, because they always assume that the vulnerability part of that stress vulnerability equation, the vulnerability part is inherited genetically. So you can't really go mad unless you've got this genetic predisposition. Well, the people who wrote that paper in 1977 said exactly the opposite. Well, that's not true. They didn't say the opposite. They said it might be genetic, but it can also be acquired. So the sensitivity to stress in that stress vulnerability model can be acquired itself through adverse events in childhood. Just important to know that. To end the research story, we put out the first meta-analysis last year. Sorry if I'm preaching to the converted here, but just so you know, a meta-analysis is one up from a review. There's rules for a meta-analysis in terms of what studies you can include and what ones you can't. And by this time, that's the good news by itself that there were so many studies. There were hundreds for us to look at, and we chose the 41 most rigorous. And surprise, surprise, people who had suffered childhood adversity in various forms were nearly 3 times more likely overall after controlling for everything else. And the dose response was there again. That's what it looks like. That's a bit overwhelming perhaps, but that line down the middle, you have to be to the right-hand side of that for your study to be supporting the hypothesis, and you can see the general pattern there. To make that a bit more simple, there's the 6 types of abuse we looked at, largely because they had the most studies connected to them. This is not a definitive list, there's all sorts of other things. It's good to see that bullying is now getting some attention. And that's increasingly a problem, of course, with all the different technologies that kids have these days to bully one another. So a lot of us have now moved on to trying to look at how child abuse and neglect leads to psychosis. I'm not going to go through all of these models, and I think they're all useful and valuable, theoretically but also clinically. Some clients like to work from a cognitive model. Attachment is a nice, simple way of explaining these sorts of things and pulling it all together. I'm going to mention, sorry, it's all run into one word there somehow, the traumagenic gap neurodevelopmental model, which is one that we've put together for a very specific reason. We did it to try and speak to what I call the contextless brain researchers. We have in our field, unlike the rest of neurology and neuroscience, in the field of psychiatry we have some extraordinarily simplistic thinking going on, which suggests that if you can find differences in the brains of 2 groups of people, then you've proved that it's entirely a biological phenomenon. And so this paper was designed to address that. This is the slide that I've seen at almost every schizophrenia conference I've attended for the last 30 or 40 years. This is the slide that definitively shows that schizophrenia is a brain disease. You can see it. It's very convincing, can't you? You can see the larger ventricles, the gaps, the smaller overall size of the brain, and so forth. And what these folk forget is that brains actually exist inside a human being, and that a human being exists in an environment. So I like to put my hand up at these conferences and say, excuse me, what do you think a brain is for? You know, there gets this stunned silence. Oh, God. We've got a weirdo in the house. And then I said, well, let me spell that out for you. What use do you think a brain would be that did not respond to the environment? And a few people start lighting up. Oh, that's an interesting idea. And eventually you have to explain to them that the first thing you should always do when you see a slide of brain differences between two groups of people is ask what happened to the people in the group whose brain is not functioning so well. So that was the paper we put out in 2001, and that was at the end of a decade where for the first time we personally, I wasn't doing this research, but the research world was discovering what was going on in the brains of traumatized young children. We didn't really know that before, but by this point we did, and we wanted to see if there was any link at all between the list of things that you'll read in every textbook, including, to my embarrassment, every psychology textbook, proving that schizophrenia is a brain disease. Is there any similarity at all between this list of things and what's going on in the brains of traumatized children? This is what we found. I'll do that again. It's an absolute perfect map. Okay? So all of those things that are supposedly evidence that schizophrenia is a brain disease that has nothing to do with the environment, purely biological phenomenon, it's like a medical illness, all those analogies to diabetes and all sorts of medical illnesses. They're all found in the brains of traumatized children. And perhaps the key one is that first one, the overactivity of the HPA axis. That's the stress regulation mechanism within the brain, or a primary stress regulation mechanism. And if in the brains of traumatized children, that gets severely damaged, so that any stresses in the future after that, it's very hard to deal with. And it's very hard to take in the soothing that comes from other people. The good news is that these things can be changed back. It's just that the earlier you get in, the better. Surprise, surprise. There's some evidence showing that psychotherapy that addresses these sorts of things in adults 30 or 40 years old can start redressing these balances. It's not a permanent state of affairs, but it's just much better to get in at age 5 than it is at age 40, obviously. Some of the implications for all of this, the obvious one is that we need to ask people about child abuse in our mental health services. Astonishingly, that doesn't happen very much from the research that we've done in various places. Some good news is that when the NHS guidelines were introduced in 2008, saying that all clients must be asked about trauma and violence, and staff must be trained, they invited me over from New Zealand to train the first 100 psychiatrists in how and when to do that. I was quite amazed at that, because I'm a bit pessimistic by nature, and I sometimes can't see when things are getting better. So that was, I guess, a sign that things are getting better. And I was saying over dinner last night that probably the most, when I retire and look back, and probably if there's one event I'll bore people to death with forever when they say, what was the highlight of your career, John, was that day training those first 100 psychiatrists, when I spent the morning boring them to death with that sort of research that I've just summarized briefly to you. And then in the afternoon, Jackie Dillon told her life story. And I sat behind Jackie and watched the tears in their eyes. And I know which part of that training day they will remember. Not minimizing the role of research, because what they couldn't do after seeing all that research, they could not do what they usually do and say, oh, well, this is a one-off. Jackie's a unique, Jackie is a unique person, we all acknowledge that, but that standard line of, well, she couldn't have been schizophrenic in the first place because she's so articulate now. So that's just a case of misdiagnosis or whatever. That's a standard defense. That was built into the concept, by the way. When Kreplin invented the concept, he actually stated, if anybody gets better, it shows they didn't have the illness in the first place. It's there in the textbook. What profession is threatened? What other profession is threatened by the idea that their patients might get better? Sorry, that's a naughty aside. Let's keep moving. It is important that you know that there is no basis to the claim that disclosures of abuse and neglect by psychiatric patients, including people with these diagnoses, should not be believed. And I stress this because this is an argument I've heard all over the world. Well, what's the point of asking these people, John? they'll make it up, they'll imagine it. I mean, they think all sorts of weird stuff, and then they're going to tell you their stepfather raped them when they were 9. Well, it's just a part of their delusional system. It is funny, but it's also terribly sad. And imagine the situation where somebody finally gets the courage, or you could argue the stupidity, I'm sorry, that's a bit rude, to tell a psychiatrist from a biological perspective about what happened to them in childhood, and they're told that's part of your delusional system. That's pretty awful, I think. So just so you know, there is no research to support that. Some more good news, because we can get a bit lost and think, we're fighting a losing battle, or I do sometimes. I've been fighting the same battles for 40 years, and sometimes it feels like we're not getting anywhere. It's important to know that when you ask the public, just about everywhere in the world, what causes mental health problems, including these supposedly biologically based illnesses like schizophrenia, in all of these countries, they identify things like poverty, loneliness, alienation, loss, abuse, neglect, stress at work, stress in the family. I know you're looking for Ireland. It's not on there. We haven't done this study. Oh, maybe, yes, well, I think we have. I can't remember. I'm not saying we did all of them, but let's wait to see if Ireland comes up, because I can't remember. Yay, yeah. There's only one country where the study has been done recently, and it goes sort of the other way, but that's that same country that just gets everything wrong. To be fair to the USA public, they are extraordinarily bombarded with drug company propaganda, which does eventually take its toll. Now, this is important for lots of reasons, I think. It doesn't make these people right. I mean, I have a fridge magnet that says never underestimate the stupidity of large groups of people. So it doesn't make them right. But it's important clinically because this is the model that people come into mental health services with. Patients or clients do not come from planet Xeon, do they? They are members of the public. So most clients, not all, but most arrive in contact with us with this model, that things have gone wrong in my life that have caused me to have the problems I've got now, and I would like to talk about them, please. And what do they often get? Tell me about your symptoms, I'll give you a label, and then I'll pick a color. Bill. And that's terribly, terribly sad. The other reason I like this slide is because when I stand up at biological psychiatry conferences, because I do go occasionally because I'm basically a masochist, and obviously they try to position the likes of myself and Gail and many of the rest of you as some sort of radicals or ideologues or extremists or odd people. So I like to stand in front of this slide and underneath it, and I say, well, just from a statistical model of abnormality, there's me and several billion people, and there's you. And then I go on to show them the research that addresses who's right. The other reason this is important is because of there's a lot of stigma around, obviously, as you know, and there's some recent studies showing that people with these diagnoses describe the stigma, the reactions from other people, as more distressing and damaging than the experiences they're having themselves that got them the diagnosis in the first place. And the biological model has intruded on this as well, because the standard destigmatization model around the world is let's treat the public to think more like biological psychiatrists. Let's teach the public that mental illness is an illness like any other. It's well intended, the dignity of the sick role, and you can't blame people if they're not responsible for their behavior and all of that stuff. It turns out that it's actually making things a lot worse if you think about it. If you don't hold another human being responsible for their behavior, you can't really have a meaningful interaction with them. You've actually relegated them to some sort of subspecies. So, hello, I'm John, I'd like to talk to you. I'm going to talk a load of crap for the next half hour. I'm not responsible for any of that. I've got no control over my behavior, but can I be your friend, please? We'll have a lot of good... Oh, by the way, I'm also dangerous. I'm unpredictably dangerous as well. But I'd really like to be your friend. So this is powerful, and I shouldn't joke about it because it's very powerful. Just so you know, again, now when you look at all the research, because this should be evidence-based as well, shouldn't it, the destigmatization programs, 31 of the studies that look at the effects of biogenetic causal beliefs make attitudes worse, and the opposite for psychosocial beliefs. Unsurprisingly, if you teach people that there's something wrong with these people's brains, they've got inferior genes, they can't control their behavior, and so you expect their attitudes to improve. It's just rubbish. But of course, drug companies are very happy to invest huge amounts of money in these destigmatization programs. I can't think why they would want to persuade the public that human distress is an illness. I don't know what they have to gain from that, but I'm sure we could figure it out. Here's more good news. In all of these countries, the public also prefer talking therapists to medication for schizophrenia. It's an even stronger preference than for depression, which surprised me. So the public, again, get it. We've won the battle with the public. It's just that we have to wrest power from a small group of people that we still allow to have all that power. So briefly, CBT. Now, Gail talked about clinical psychology and psychiatry. Somewhat broad brush. I sort of have some obligation to stand up for clinical psychology a little bit, Gail, so give me permission. Although there's a lot of clinical psychologists around who do fall into that individual pathologizing model. But in our area of psychosis, cognitive therapy has proved to be extraordinarily effective. It's not because it's more effective than other psychological models, it's just that they are better researchers. There's a lot of psychodynamic people out there who are doing excellent work, but they don't show that it works. They know that it works, and actually that doesn't cut it anymore. You have to show that it works. Interestingly, however, when we dissect the studies showing that CBT works for psychosis, the best predictor of a good outcome is not the specific cognitive techniques that they use, although I think those can be very helpful. It's a model designed for disordered thinking, if you think about it. The best predictor is actually, surprise, surprise, the quality of the therapeutic relationship between the two people, which is true of any model. It's true for medication as well. People get better on medication if they like their doctor, far more than if they don't like their doctor. We've just done a study of 2,000 people in New Zealand on antidepressants, and just about the most powerful predictor of whether the drugs worked was whether or not they thought their GP understood their problem. I think that speaks for itself. I made myself a promise a long time ago that I'd never give a talk on mental health without naming the elephant in the room, which is the drug companies. Astonishingly influential, particularly in America, but elsewhere. The DSM-5 that just came out, I think 73% of the people on those committees were in the pay of drug companies. So, surprise, surprise, they expanded all the boundaries in the way that Gail talked about yesterday. So don't stay sad for more than 2 weeks after somebody dies, as Gail pointed out. It's astonishing. We've done a few studies looking at the website, which of course is where people get their information these days, and those are the percentages of websites on those topics that are funded by drug companies. Not always obvious. You have to dig around sometimes to find whether they're drug company funded or not. And of course, all of those websites push a more biological model and push medication. More good news. People, after decades of silence, are speaking out on this very important issue. So here's a brave person from America, Steve Sharfstein, president of the American Psychiatric Association. Financial incentives have contributed to the notion of a quick fix by taking a pill and reducing the emphasis on psychotherapy and psychosocial treatments. If we are seen as mere pill pushers and employees of the pharmaceutical industry, our credibility as a profession is compromised. As we address these big pharma issues, we must examine the fact that as a profession, we have allowed the biopsychosocial model to become the bio model. Meanwhile, in the same year, his counterpart in the UK, Mike Schutis, put it a little more succinctly when he said, "I cannot be the only person to be sickened by the sight of parties of psychiatrists standing at the airport desk with so many gifts with them, they might as well have the name of the drug company tattooed across their foreheads." Good on them. It's very good that the silence has been broken. And more importantly, I think recently you'll have read that the drug companies are not only being taken to court now, but they're not getting away, as they have done for decades, with settling out of court. They're actually getting fined. So you'd have read recently a £2 billion fine for advertising antipsychotics for children, £2 billion. So that's sort of a 10% dent in their January profits. But it's an important point nevertheless. I'm going to end with a few quotes. This is one from Wilma, a service user in the Netherlands, who kind of disagrees with me a bit about the theory of trauma and psychosis. And I put this in because it's a reminder that every person's story is different. Research can't capture that. I don't think abuse itself is a strong cause for psychosis. It hurts, but it's rather simple. I think that the threat and the betrayal that come with it feed psychosis. The betrayal of the family that says, you must have asked for it, instead of standing up for you. That excuses the offender and accuses the victim and forces the child to accept the reality of the adults. That forces the child to say that the air is green while she sees clearly it is not green but blue. That is a distortion of reality that is very hard to deal with when you're a child. You are forced to betray yourself. That is what causes the twilight zone, what makes you vulnerable for psychosis. And some quotes from a survey we did in New Zealand just before we started doing the training program for mental health professionals on how to ask about trauma, because we were told that this is a bad idea, it will upset people if we start asking them about trauma. So we surveyed a whole bunch of users who were very angry actually about never having been asked at all. There was an assumption that I had a mental illness, and because I wasn't saying anything about my abuse, no one knew. There were so many doctors and nurses and social workers in your life, and I'm sure psychologists, asking you about the same thing, mental, but not asking you why. I just wish they would have said, what happened to you? What happened? But they didn't. Last bit of advertising. You know about the Hearing Voices Network. You're going to hear more about it. I want you to know about the International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis, even though it has the longest name of any organization in the world. We hope that very soon Ireland will join the other 23 countries with a branch, if any of you feel inspired to do so. It's the organization that puts out the journal that I edit and that book series that you know about. Finally, 1 minute, literally. Implications for primary prevention, because usually we talk about the implications for clinical work, and that's of course important to most of you in the room. Don't forget the implications for primary prevention of this research. And by primary prevention, I don't mean early psychosis intervention teams. I mean primary prevention, first 5 years of life. That meta-analysis did a clever thing and calculated what's called the estimated population attributable risk of those 6 types of childhood adversity. Basically, and the figure was 33%, basically that means if we could magically eradicate those 6 childhood adversities, the level of psychosis in society would be reduced by 1/3. So it is important, and I'm going to end up with a hero, George Albee. I have lots of villains in my stories, so I like to end with a hero, who unfortunately is a man who, if you turn his head upside down, he looks exactly the same. But he was a wonderful man who spent his whole life trying to convince psychologists like me to spend more time focusing on primary prevention, telling us that if you know the causes of these things, why aren't you out there advocating more for creating safe circumstances for children in the first 5 years of life? So I'll end with this quote. Psychologists, and all of us, must join with persons who reject racism, sexism, colonialism, and exploitation, and must find ways to redistribute social power and to increase social justice. Primary prevention research inevitably will make clear the relationship between social pathology and psychopathology, and then will work to change social and political structures in the interests of social justice. It is as simple and as difficult as that. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much, John, for a very inspiring talk and all the ammunition that we all need. So thank you very much for that. We do have time for a few questions. So, please.
I've lost the mic, so I'm going to go to the top and work my way down.
That was brilliant, John. Thank you. I wanted to know if anybody has thought of doing any research about the mental health system being the cause of mental illness, but not particularly on the patients. I was thinking more on the cause of the distresses of the professionals, the abuse systems that go on in medical schools that take these beautiful young children that are thriving and going on, and many of them themselves, by the stage they get to medical schools, service users of the mental health system in today's society, and then churns them out. And we're doing bullying. Have we done any bullying of how the mental health system operates?
Not that I know of, but that's made me want to go have a look now. So thank you for raising that. I haven't looked at the figures recently, but psychiatrists, for instance, used to have, tell me if I'm out of date, somebody, used to have the second highest suicide rate of any profession, second only to dentists, which is sad. And I think you're right. Most people, when they start out at medical school, go into psychiatry or many of them go in for the right reasons, and it gets trained out of them, and that must be very hard. So I'll have a look at that. It's interesting. Thank you.
Hi, I'm just wondering, is your research available publicly? Can we download your papers?
Yes, some of them on the University of Liverpool website, but you can email me and I'll flick on any papers that you want.
John's presentation will be available as a podcast on the Schools of Nursing website and on the Applied Social Studies website as well in the next few days or weeks. So, and of course, John was promoting his books as well, and they're available in the bookshop.
Questions in the front here?
Thanks, Harry.
Yes,
my retirement fund.
Thanks for the check. Anyway, we are sort of running. No, we take one more question. I think. No, it's maybe not fair, but.
John, really enjoyed your presentation. During the presentation, you said about childhood trauma and that it would be better to get in at age 5 than in at age 40. I have a two-part question. I'm wondering, with what? Like what, if you have a 5-year-old child, what do you get in with? Yeah. And then I would worry then that I was actually putting somebody into the system of the mental health system. How do you combat that? Yeah.
Yes, I'm always wary when you see new either infant mental health services or mental health services for young people. You're supposed to be excited about that, and I thought, oh God, we're going to start medicating them even earlier. What they actually need, if they've been traumatized and have those sorts of problems regulating stress, number one, obviously they need to be removed from the abusive environment and put somewhere safe. And then what needs to happen is, because basically attachment systems are blown out of the water as well. So basically it's obvious. They need a constant relationship with a safe person, or more than one person. And in terms of therapy, and at any age, the goal is to get, along with whatever other goals the person has, the goal is to get those stress regulation mechanisms back regulated again. So that involves repeated minimal levels of stress and soothing, which you can do in therapy by talking about what happened, but in a safe way, and the soothing. And then the brain just sort of slowly reprograms itself to be able to do that. And you can do that with 5-year-olds, you can do it with 40-year-olds. It's just that it's easier to do it with 5-year-olds because the pattern is less well ingrained. Yeah. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks again.
Okay, just on a practical note for the people sitting or standing at the back, there are seats actually in the front or in between. So if you want to move. Okay, so Thank you again very much, John. And now I would like to welcome our second speaker, Irene van der Hissen from the Netherlands. Irene is an expert by experience. She has her own company, but she also works in a psychiatric ward in a hospital in the Netherlands. So we are very pleased to have you with us, Irene. Welcome.